Well, qualifying in the Azerbaijan Grand Prix just got over, and it's quite the result, especially if you're a Ferrari fan, because it's your man Charles Leclerc who's sitting on pole position at Baku. Now, obviously, we know that the Baku street circuit does tend to more often than not serve some very interesting qualifying sessions, and that is exactly what happened this time around as well, because given what was happening in practice and given what was happening with the Red Bulls in terms of their development, in terms of what exactly was going on in the practice sessions, and even the first two qualifying sessions, there was some doubt as to who exactly would end up on top in terms of who would be starting the race on pole. Because as we know, in Q3 itself, you had Carlos Sainz, who was actually sitting on provisional pole after the first runs. But then Leclerc put in an absolutely monster lap to end up taking the pole position towards the final bits of the qualifying session. But what is perhaps a little bit concerning if you're a Ferrari fan is who sits at P2 and P3. Because at P2 you have Sergio Perez, who ahead of this race weekend said that yes, he is looking forward to being up and about in terms of the title mix. He backs that up with a monster qualifying performance, out qualifying Verstappen, which is in itself a rarity because, as we know, Max Verstappen, very good driver when it comes to his qualifying laps, almost flawless, but well, Sergio Perez is out qualified. Not by much, not even about a hundredth of a second, but very, very good from his part, regardless, because, well, as we said, Perez is normally not someone whose qualifying performances are the best. He's often better when it comes to his racecraft, protecting his tires. We don't call him the tire whisperer for nothing, but P2, he would be very happy with that, especially considering that in Baku, the last part is a very, very long straight, so plenty of overtaking opportunities there. He would be backing himself, especially considering what was also being said on commentary. Remember, we're saying that both the Red Bull and the Ferraris have turned up their engines to the maximum level mode. There's no longer a case of keeping it down, and the commentators were estimating that on average the Red Bulls would be 9 kilometers per hour faster than the Ferraris. So actually being P2, P3, not the worst thing in the world for them, especially if they can get their race pace and take care of their tires well. Shouldn't be much of a problem for them. You have to feel just a little bit for Carlos Sainz though. I mean, he was the fastest guy after the first laps. He's only ending up P4, and the longer the season drags on, the more it seems likely that he will at best be playing a support role towards Charles Leclerc's title bid. But of course, the Red Bulls, of course, both of them are on top form, and that's also a concern if you're a Ferrari fan because both of them seem to be competing and looking for that top spot. Whereas at Ferrari, Leclerc is waging pretty much a lone battle. How will this pan out tomorrow? Well, that's something that will need to be seen. But let's talk about the other results which were there as well. George Russell, by the way, who has finished all of the last few races in P5, has actually going to be starting this race P5 because that's where he qualified. Pierre Gasly, whose recent form has been questionable to say the least, has ended up qualifying in P6. Behind him is a certain Sir Lewis Hamilton in P7. P8, by the way, is Yuki Tsunoda, who's been having a pretty decent run of things in recent times. He'd be happy with coming P8. P9, Sebastian Vettel in the Aston Martin. And Aston Martin, I think if you're Lance Stroll, you'd be kicking yourself for having that crash in Q1. Because as we can see, with Vettel in 9, there is some serious race pace in that car. And P10 is a certain Fernando Alonso, who, if you remember, in the first practice session on Friday practice, FP1, was actually up to top 4. So not a bad showing from the wily old Spaniard. But, and yes, I do absolutely agree with you, Gaurav. Checo is in top form, and King of Baku, that's a very interesting one. He did, as we know, he got a podium finish there when he was at Force India. He won the race last year, which was a bit of a classic in that regard because you had Max Verstappen's tire blowout, you had Lewis Hamilton's the brake malfunction. So there's everything going on in that race. I would personally be hoping that this year's race is just as exciting, but again, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. But of course, if you have some drivers are going to be happy, there's going to be quite a few asking questions. Lando Norris will in particular not be a happy chappy because or at least he thought that he had the race pace to be making it into Q3, but had to abort one lap because Lewis Hamilton was deemed to be driving very slowly, as there's no certainty as to what exactly is going to be happening there yet. The stewards did say that they will investigate that after the session ends. So for all you know, Hamilton might not actually be starting P7. If they deem that his offense was penalty worthy, then he'll be starting from the back, from a lower position that is, but let's wait and watch on that. Daniel Ricciardo's poor form in this season continues, only good enough for P12. And in fact, in his final lap in Q2, he did seem to be gaining some pace, but then at the end of it, nothing. Esteban Ocon in the Alpine had a pretty decent practice time, but only P13 here. The Alfa Romeos of Guan Yu Zhou and Valtteri Bottas, 14-15. Again, disappointing recent form for them in that regard, but perhaps nothing would be as disappointing as the run of form that the Haas cars showed. Because again, Kevin Magnussen, who's been quite clearly the star driver of that team, only good enough for 16 fastest. Mick Schumacher starts in an all too familiar 20th position. Alongside, he'd be starting alongside Lance Stroll, who crashed, and ahead of them will be Alex Albon and the other Williams of Nicholas Latifi. So, I mean, we don't really know. The bottom part seems to be pretty set. Will the other midfield teams be able to get in a bit of a push? Again, you have to remember, Baku, not exactly an easy circuit. Yes, you have plenty of straights, so there will be overtaking opportunities, but there are parts of the track that are very, very tight, and the margins are very fine. That's something we saw even today in qualifying. There were a lot of drivers who weren't necessarily kissing the wall as much as they were barging into it, and there were quite a few times when you saw drivers were trying to find that limit, but more often than not going over that limit. So it's not something you want to be doing, particularly on a street circuit where the margins are this fine. So obviously, I think we're set for a very, very exciting race tomorrow. I personally can't wait. I'd be hoping to see that my team, which is of course Mercedes and of course my favorite drivers, Hamilton and Russell, can pull something out from this. I mean, P5, P7, not the worst place in the world to be starting, but it will require some strategy, some good strategy on their part. And speaking of strategies, that's again something that the Ferraris will be worried about, because the Ferrari doesn't lack pace, but in the last few races, more often than not, it's been poor strategic calls that has been their undoing. They will hope to be rectifying that tomorrow, because again, Leclerc is in pole. Can they get him to a win and potentially maybe actually cut that deficit to Max Verstappen, who's currently leading the championship? That's going to be the hope, but they'll have to do a lot better, strategically speaking, than they have in the past two races. Anyway, do join us after the race tomorrow. We'll be going live. Of course, I'll be there. I'll join you guys. We'll have a little fun talking about the race, seeing what happens. I personally am very hyped for this race. I hope you guys are as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Tap the bell icon. Stay tuned with us. We will be bringing you a lot more from the world of sports, not just in terms of cricket. Remember, India playing an AFC Asian Cup qualifier as well. I'll be joining you once that's over. Don't forget to join me for that as well. Bye-bye for now. Take care.